Shall I start? Okay, so, well, good morning. First of all, I just want to make a small apology for the fact that, as you might hear, the sound over here, my computer is dying. And, well, I'm trying my best to resist, to resist the fact that I have to buy a new computer. But so it's 6 years old, which I think is a record for. But sorry, I have to. Yes. So I apologize if something happened during my lecture. First of all, welcome for this seminar, which, as you might know from the program, attempts to address, let's say, the development of architectural theory from Vitruvius to the 20th century by specifically commenting canonical texts that have, in fact, identified this development. But, of course, there is a lot of literature on this particular topic, so I think you have a lot of possibilities to deepen much more this particular, let's say, subject. But what I would like to do in this seminar is to link this canonical text not only within their own discourse, which is, of course, architecture and eventually town planning, but I would like to connect these books to the particular context, both social and political context in which these texts were written, which is something that one often can read in very specific commentaries of these books, but it's not always an obvious, let's say, angle through which to read these books. I would like to, let's say, summarize this particular point of view with the Greek word ethos, which is, in my work, in my research, is a very important keyword, a word that can roughly translated in English as character. Ethos is the character of a given society or a given civilizations, the customs, the habits that constitute the social and political fabric of a particular period or of a particular, let's say, society. And it's precisely in the ethos that politics reach its utmost, let's say, manifestation. So we are very often to see politics in the form of particular symbolic events or in the form of particular symbolic figures or references, but it's much more difficult to recognize politics in the ethos that construct the habits and the customs of which we are part. And I have to say that especially today, especially in the 21st century, politics has to do more with ethos, with the way actually we, in the everyday, we relate to each other than with the representation of politics, which of course we increasingly perceive as something that is outside of our current and more daily preoccupations. Now, I would like to address the problem of architectural theory precisely from this point of view, which is, if you want, more related to our contemporary understanding of politics as ethos. Of course, for the sake of clarity, I organized the material in a very traditional and, if you want, also very rudimental way by selecting a series of books and presenting them chronologically. So it was very, I have to say, obvious to start with Vitruvius, De Architectura, because actually it's perhaps not the first book or the first text that deals with architecture as a specific form of knowledge, but for sure is the first systematic book that address architecture, and is of course, as you might all know, the only text that has survived from antiquity that deals directly with architecture. So Vitruvius, whether we like him or not, is the founding father of our discipline. I mean, he's not, of course, the father of architecture as a practice, which existed much long before Vitruvius. Vitruvius actually is what has emancipated architecture from the practice, let's say, of building to a form of reasoning, a form of knowledge. And this is exactly what is the ambition of the text that Vitruvius wrote in the 20s, called the Architectura Libri Decem, the 10 books on architecture, which really had the ambition to systematize in an almost encyclopedic fashion the knowledge of architecture. And in fact, we can say that we can blame, as many architects and researchers have done, Vitruvius to not be really the most fashionable architect. His references are perhaps already at that time he was writing the book quite old. Of course, we can blame Vitruvius to be a very obscure writer at times, especially when he has to deal with technical problems. Alberti, who has written perhaps the most ferocious critique of Vitruvius in his attempt to write the 10 books on architecture, De Figatoria, claimed that it was better that Vitruvius had never written a book on architecture, because actually instead of clarifying this, he had made even things more confused. But we have to praise Vitruvius for one thing, which I think is very important, and is precisely his attempt to treat architecture in a radically systematic way. So Vitruvius has really the ambition to address a subject that at that time was, as a knowledge, not as a practice, was pretty much confused. I mean, it was of course dealt by very important, let's say, thinkers like Cicero, Varro, who might have the person that has almost invented or made known the term architecture itself. But it was never the subject of a systematic study. And there is an impetus in Vitruvius' style of addressing architecture that is clearly encyclopedic. And in fact, Vitruvius is one of the first writers to really clearly adopt in a very, let's say, radical way this approach to knowledge, which in fact makes the architectura not only interesting for architecture itself, but really as a sort of attempt to systematize knowledge from, of course, the point of view of building and constructing a place. And in fact, it's very important to understand, it's very important to understand the architectura within the concept, the Greek concept of enkylios paideia, which is exactly the etymological roots of encyclopedia. The idea of constructing a text that would be read as a general course on a particular, let's say, set of knowledge, and is exactly what is the very form of the architectura. I mean, the architectura really has this overall encompassing architecture in itself as a book, not only for actually the subject it transmits. Now, this is a very important aspect which I will later on develop and explain why Vitruvius actually felt the urgency to deal with architecture not in an occasional fragmentary way, but in such a systematic fashion. For now, I would like to show you actually the very architecture of the book as an object. This is actually how, at Vitruvius' times, the architectura appeared in the reconstruction made by Indra Cages McEwen, who has written for me one of the most interesting study on Vitruvius, Writing the Body of Architecture, which I strongly recommend you to read as after my rather rudimental introduction. She's actually had made a reconstruction of the way actually the books were organized. 10 books has a very specific meaning. 10, as Vitruvius also described in his book, is a perfect number. It's a number that has a symmetry in itself. And symmetry, as we will see, is a fundamental concept in Vitruvius' idea of architecture, but also idea of the world. And for him is a fundamental instrument to organize things, to give things a cohesive body. Body is a word that Vitruvius stress obsessively in his book Corpus, which in fact is the fundamental metaphor through which, or if you want analogy, through which actually understand architecture, not as a set of fragmentary, let's say, things, but really as a body, as something that has a fundamental symmetry, like the human body, and therefore, through this symmetry, it organizes the whole knowledge that we have of the world. And what is interesting is that the appearance itself of the object, each book, of course, was written in a scroll, and the way actually the scrolls are presented, it clearly emphasized the concept of symmetry by almost resembling a pediment, which, as you will Vitruvius stress, in architecture is one of the fundamental archetype of symmetry. This is very important for all the books that we will read. In architecture, but I would say in general, a book should not only be read, but should also be seen. The book itself is an object, is a form, which cannot be detached from its content. I mean, one of the fundamental mistakes in reading a book is to disconnect the body of the book from its, let's say, content. And in Vitruvius, this is actually very important because, as you see, the very presentation of these 10 books stress this sort of symmetry, harmony between the different subjects, which, of course, in Vitruvius, as we'll see, has no a sort of innocent meaning. It's precisely this harmony that, in our own terms, we can almost translate as a sort of overreaching apparatus that is the very political and cultural significance of Vitruvius' attempt to systematize architectural knowledge. Now, of course, we have to immediately, as when we read every book, go through the list of contents. You see how efficiently Vitruvius is able to cover, distribute what he thought were the main topics, the main subjects of an architect expertise. Of course, starting with the very, let's say, basic place of architecture, which is the layout of cities, a practice that in Roman times was of fundamental importance, because to found a city, define the start, let's say a city was starting a civilization, starting basically the very ethos of a people that were conquered by the Romans. The Romans really gave to the act of foundation, which was a very complex ritual, a fundamental importance, and therefore the design of cities was not just the design of infrastructure or of, let's say, the pragmatic needs of a certain place, but it was really the ritual of defining the ethos of a particular civilization, and therefore for Vitruvius is the very beginning of architectural expertise. Of course, after that, he explained building materials, but the most interesting, let's say, one of the most interesting aspects of the Architettura that Vitruvius, and we will see later why, devotes 2 chapters out of 10 to temples, the third and the fourth. In the third, actually, and the fourth, the most influential item of Vitruvian theory, especially for Renaissance, is treated the orders, what actually later on would be called orders, which Vitruvius called types. And this is actually, again, a very interesting aspect. It's not obvious to, let's say, devote out of 10 books, 2 books entirely on a specific building, which we will see later has a very strategic importance in the time where Vitruvius was writing the Architettura. Of course, public building, private building, finishing, I mean, the way actually things are ornamented and let's say, made inhabitable, where in fact what is interesting that Vitruvius seems to ignore fundamental aspects that already at that time in Roman architecture were very important, like, for example, vaulting, which is exactly what characterized Roman architecture vis-a-vis, for example, Greek architecture. So this is something that has always made critics and historians on Vitruvius think that, of course, he has a very retrograde and old-fashioned outlook on architecture. Water, of course, a fundamental element that for Vitruvius, together with fire, constitute the very origin of settling a place. And then one of the two most, let's say, curious books that in fact made Vitruvius' approach to architecture very unique also especially to what architectural theory will deal with later. Sundials and clocks, which, as we will see later, play a very important role again in the context in which Vitruvius is writing the Architettura, but it's something that was not obvious, that was supposed to be part of the knowledge of an architect. And of course, machines, especially war machines. Vitruvius happened to live, especially at the beginning of his career, in a very special moments of the history of ancient Rome, where of course conflict and war was a fundamental, let's say, event. And in fact, it's known that Vitruvius had served as a soldier together with Caesar, and therefore he had the direct responsibility in the construction of war machines, especially ballistas and catapults, which of course in the then book, and it's very interesting that Vitruvius finished the Architettura with such a book on warfare, basically with very, very interesting anecdotes, one of which is really the concluding remark of the book, and I will explain you at the end. It's very interesting that the Architettura really ends with these two expertise, which of course projects architecture far beyond the scope of edificatio, and of course understand architecture within the paradigm of machinatio, of machining things, of machining of something that is no longer static, but something that has to do with movement and with a very specific, let's say, goal of governing and fighting within, let's say, a very unstable social context. So that's very interesting, because on one hand we have this strong attempt towards unity and a cohesive framework through which, of which architecture has to be the supreme metaphor. But at the same time, Vitruvius also shows how an aspect of that supreme, let's say, stability is precisely instability, danger, those conditions that characterize precisely the events that Vitruvius describe at the very end of the Architettura. I would like now to go through a series of keywords which Vitruvius introduced, especially in the introduction. I mean, Vitruvius has a very, use actually a typical style of organizing textbooks, which was to have for each chapter a preface, an introduction, usually the most enjoyable part of the book, and then he would actually, with a series of chapters, deal with more technical issues. And what is interesting about the preface is that they are not immediately introducing the particular topic of each book. There are usually a general discussion about architecture, so you can almost take all the preface of the books and you will have a kind of general dissertation on the meaning of architecture itself. Of course, the most important part is the introduction, where Vitruvius, of course, addressed the Emperor Augustus. We will see later how this addressing is the very meaning of why Vitruvius wrote the Architettura. And of course, he introduced a series of words, which is very interesting because already at that time, architecture is understood not just as a matter of building, but really as a matter of communication, of communicating, transmitting something. And in fact, the first lexical almost clarification that Vitruvius introduced is the difference between signified and signifier. Signified, of course, is the object of inquiry, architecture itself as a building, as a space. But for Vitruvius, it's also important the role of signifier. he really used these words, of course in Latin, which is the terminology that one needs to conduct a proper discussion. So Vitruvius stressed from the very beginning there is no architecture if it's not something that we can speak about. So if there is no terminology, if there is no a sort of language framework, architecture itself cannot exist. Another set of concepts which are very important to understand the very, let's say, object of the Architettura is the distinction that Vitruvius made between the concept of fabrica, which is exactly what existed before architecture, the practice of building, which anybody can basically exercise, and the faculty of ratiocinatio, reasoning. And this is actually for Vitruvius is fundamentally important. Architecture is not only about building, but it's also about reasoning. It's about organizing mentally and verbally the matter of architecture. And Vitruvius really insists that without ratiocinatio, there is no architecture. Architecture cannot be just fabrica. But at the same time, ratiocinatio, in order to become explicable and representable, needs fabrica, needs the practice of building. But I think what is very important to stress is the way Vitruvius really emancipate architecture from just the practice of building and identify ratiocinatio, reasoning, as the very core of architectural knowledge. Of course, having defined this set of words, Vitruvius also mentioned those disciplines which at the time were already much more established than architecture, that every architect should basically know, such as, for example, history, philosophy, music, medicine, and law. Now, these disciplines were not mentioned by Vitruvius as a sort of rudimental fair play towards other colleagues busy with other, let's say, matters, but they had a very practical meaning in the practice of an architect. History was useful because it was the only way one could understand the customs of a given population and therefore understand the meaning of architectural elements. Philosophy, of course, is a way to exercise, to enforce reasoning as a sort of way of thinking. Music, of course, is an excuse to be familiar with mathematics and arithmetics, which is, of course, very important in the architectural calculus. And medicine, of course, has to do with knowing that today we would say architecture has an ecology. So architecture is not just built matter, but is actually influence, and influence actually a much more larger context. And finally, law. An architect has to defend himself from suits, from the accused of either berbering or not promising through the realized project his own intentions. This was actually one of the reasons why at the time of Vitruvius and even before, there were already texts on architecture, which were often written not as, let's say, because the, let's say, intellectual interest in architecture, but simply as a defense of architects against patrons or clients that were not eventually satisfied with their own work. So architects were writing memoirs or commentaries or memories about what they have done and what were the intentions. And in a way, we can almost speculate that Vitruvius was inspired by this rather fragmented literature to, in fact, compose a final textbook that would, in fact, allow the architect to understand what was precisely his own position. Another set of definitions, which I think are very important to understand in order to really, because Vitruvius has a very strong, like any other writer about architecture, strong importance to words and their meaning. And this is actually a very important, a way through which Vitruvius really manipulates the matter of architecture. A fundamental category that Vitruvius introduced in the first book is the concept of ordinatio, ordering, which is, of course, immediately followed by the concept of dispositio. Now, this actually, again, Vitruvius always played with this couple of words. Ordinatio is exactly the scheme, the mental scheme, or the module, or the, if you want, the aiding grill that we need in order to start to design architecture. So every architectural design is always framed by a system of measurements, by a system of proportions, whatever you can think about, without which they cannot be designed. So in a way, the ordinatio could be something like this. This is an illustration by Serlio, a grid that architects, for example, at this time needs to basically lay down their own design. The second concept is dispositio, which can be, in fact, the analogous in English of design, which is precisely to order things according to a very specific ordinatio. And is exactly what Vitruvius emphasized in the Architettura, the idea of using drawing as a way to design things according to a specific order. Again, here is very interesting, it's very refined the way Vitruvius really emancipate the role of drawing, which, as you know by experience, very often has its own reality, which is reducible to architecture as a building, because it implies a set of conventions that one has to apply in order to translate a drawing from building and vice versa. And Vitruvius is fully aware of that kind of translation, which is exactly where the architectural idea lies, according to him. And in fact, the design, the act of design, is exactly the crucial moment of making architecture. And design is not building. We don't have, of course, drawings of antiquity, but already at the time of Vitruvius, drawing, the act of design, plays a very important role. Design actually is divided, disegno, or design, or let's say the act of design is divided in three parts, which are still the convention through which we represent architecture. Iconographia, which are the plans, orthographia, which are the elevations, and finally scenographia, which is the three-dimensional representation. So drawing is the materialization of the disposition of the architectural elements. So we can say that together ordinatio and dispositio coincide with what in modernity we would define as partie, which is one of the fundamental categories of architectural design. I mean, the whole history of architectural design, not architectural building, but architectural design, which is the translation of built matter into lines, no? into two-dimensional projections, can be defined as the logic of the partie. And of course, Vitruvius does not use this French word, which would be canonical, especially in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, but he really insists on this coupling relationship between ordinatio and dispositio. Of course, eurythmia is another fundamental word that which Vitruvius used, a Greek word, which is the properness, the beauty, the good shape of the elements in themselves. A fundamental archetype of eurythmia is the column, which we will see later is a fundamental tool through which Vitruvius constructs his own architecture. The concept of symmetria, very, very important in Vitruvius' discourse, because unlike eurythmia, which is the beauty, or if you want, the properness of the element in itself, symmetria is the commensurability of all the elements together. So symmetria is not what we usually understand, something that has just, it's defined by a central axis, no? Symmetria is the shared measure that different elements have, and therefore allow a certain manipulation or a certain design of them according to certain intentions. And we will see that this concept for Vitruvius resonates with a particular political project in which Vitruvius happened to, which is rather extraordinary, in which Vitruvius happened to write the Architettura. And of course, the concept of decorum and distributio. Decorum, of course, is the correctness that architecture has to bear vis-a-vis its use. And it's interesting that Vitruvius see nature at the very end of the triad that justify the correctness, the decorum of a building. First come function, the use, so something that is profoundly mundane, and of course tradition. A building has to be proper to the specific place, the specific customs, otherwise it cannot be used. So it's a very mundane, let's say, interpretation of decorum. And finally, distributio. Of course, the architect has to be knowledgeable about cost and the, let's say, maintenance and the estimation of costs that any architectural building imply. Now, I want to now shift to the context in why actually this, let's say, architecture, because really you have to understand the Architettura as a project. And this is actually something I will put forward in every session. These are not just books that are simply useful because you might apply this knowledge. You have to understand that every of these writers, and I think Vitruvius in primis, treated writing and the writing of this specific book as a project in itself, which has a moral and also in an indirect way political significance. So therefore, we have to understand where these projects were made and why their specific architecture, which I try to describe very rudimentarily, resonates with a specific context in which was built. Vitruvius actually wrote the Architettura at the very end of one of the fundamental events in ancient Roman history, and of course in the history of the Western world, which is the decline, the turmoil of the civil wars, and the decline of the Republic, the very first political form of ancient Rome, and the rise of the empire. Indeed, the 20s, the decade in which Vitruvius wrote the Architettura, saw the rise of an emperor, a new figure in the political, let's say, order of Rome, rather extraordinary, Augustus, the stepson of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar actually can be seen, and you know that he would have a rather tragic end of his life, killed because actually he was seen as someone who was attempting to concentrate all the power of the Republic in his hands. In fact, Augustus is actually what completes, in a way, the project of Caesar by, in fact, shifting the political form of the ancient Rome from republic to empire. At the beginning of the Architettura, as I said before, Augustus is addressing the emperor, and in fact he's saying something very interesting. He's addressing Augustus, the emperor of Rome. Of course, as you know, Augustus is not its real name. The real name is Octavianus. Augustus actually is addressed while he's taking possession of the world. It's a very interesting sentence, which in a way is a very delicate way through which Vitruvius is describing a rather tragic history through which actually Augustus has become emperor, which is precisely the ending of civil wars. Now, you have to understand that in any civilization, there is nothing worse than a civil war, because it's the war where, let's say, the winning and the losing cannot be separated into different populations or to different, let's say, opposing point of views, but they happen precisely within the same custom, the same, let's say, people, and the same society. So one of the most, one of the utmost political efforts is to reconcile a population after a civil war. And in fact, taking possession of the world is a way for Vitruvius to avoid, to tell the true story, which is that Augustus becomes the emperor to terminate, to impose a pax, to impose a peace, and terminates the civil wars that have, let's say, complicated the history of Rome in the last century before Christ. And in fact, it's very interesting that it's precisely this attempt to reconstruct a society, to reconstruct a cohesive body vis-a-vis actually this sort of political collapse that happened during the century that anticipate the rise of Augustus, is exactly what the Architectura stands for. The Architectura is one of the first texts, and this is really interesting, and we really have to understand this aspect of this book, written at the very rise of the empire, of the Roman Empire. And it's not a coincidence that Vitruvius felt the urge to propose architecture as a cohesive body of knowledge that eventually encompassed different disciplines and different forms of knowledge, at the moment in which there is a figure, the emperor, who really tried to address the whole world in a new fashion, where in fact the concept of agreement, consensus, organic unity takes a fundamental role. Now I would like you to just look at this very beautiful statue, which is one of the most moving and perhaps radical portraits of this emperor, who you have to understand was the first person to be addressed not only with the title of emperor, but also with this name Augustus, which has a double almost meaning. It, of course, augere in Latin means to make things grow, and it was a generic title given to things that were very important and precious and have something to do with religion, like, for example, temples. So it's very new that this, let's say, term is dedicated to a person, to a figure, like Octavianus. But also, Augustus shared the same etymological meaning of auguri, which were the high priests that were responsible to organize the rather eclectic and complex rituals of Roman religion. And in fact, one of the reasons that historians have put forward why the Republic had fallen in decline was precisely the uncontrollable nature of Roman religion that was rather not only complex, but its pantheon was made of divinities that were very often taken from all the places in which the Romans had conquered a particular population. And this actually is exactly one of the fundamental problems of reconstructing the political strength of Rome, is to reorganize its religious organization. And one of the fundamental roles of the emperor is precisely to be the interface, the unique interface between people and basically let's say, Roman cult. And this is actually very, very important. And that's actually why, as you have seen before, Vitruvius devotes 2 books out of 10 to temples. Temples in the age of Augustus have, of course, a religious role, but they also have a strategic public role, which is to reunite, to, let's say, make more cohesive the religious worship, which during the late time of the Republic had completely fragmented. Now, I would like to really make you focus on these statues. This is actually the famous statues of Augusto of Prima Porta, which was found in the Livia's villas at Prima Porta. Livia is the very influential wife of Augustus. It might be a copy of an original. But what is interesting is that the very features of this statue, because they really describe what is at stake, both in Augustus' political leadership, but also in Vitruvius' understanding of this political leadership and its translation into his book. There are 2 actually very interesting aspects. of these statues. The first one is that the statue Augustus is, we actually here is portrayed as a soldier with the paludamentum, which was exactly the means of recognition for commander-in-chief. But what is interesting is that the statue makes the gestures of addressing probably the troops. So it's a statue that is speaking, something that is very unique in the iconography of ancient Greek Roman statues. Statues are perhaps known to have no, let's say, the word. They are rather still. And yet here the Augustus is speaking, is making the gestures of speaking. So he's making clear that in his own leadership, logos, in the incarnation of speech, is the most fundamental, let's say, feature, attribute of a new political leadership. He wears the clothes of a soldier, but is using speech and logos, and therefore ratiocinatio, the reasoning, as the fundamental means of political sovereignty. Another very interesting, and of course, what is interesting is that it's that this, let's say, way of addressing political leadership makes reference to another famous body, which is Polykleitos Doryphoros, a statue that was made by Polykleitos to address the canon of the perfect body, a practice that was very diffuse in ancient Greek Hellenistic art, the building of certain particular temples or statues that would incarnate the idea of perfection. The Doryphoros was a statue with a spear, and it's interesting that we can say that Augustus statues is a version of the Doryphoros without the spear, the symbol of military force, and the replacement with military force with reasoning, with speech. Another interesting details of the statue is the curias. You see that in the curias there is a sort of very complex iconographic motif, but the most interesting detail is exactly what happened under the chest. You see someone who is giving back to a Roman soldier, perhaps a general, the famous Roman standards. The standards were the banners that the Roman legions always carried with the army, and in the, let's say, Roman Republic and also in the Roman Empire were the utmost, almost physical presence of Rome, while the legions were basically conquering a foreign population. And this actually gesture of giving back these banners refers to a particular event which made Augustus' reputation incredibly crucial for his rise as an emperor, which was actually his recuperation of the banners from the Parthians, a population in the Middle East that have stole these banners during a conflict. This was really one of the utmost symbolic events that represented the idea of defeat. And what is interesting is that Augustus recuperated these banners not by war, but by a very clever diplomatic mission. Again, the stress on reasoning as the fundamental way to basically hold and organize power, which is clearly represented in the curias, which, as you know, is the dress of a soldier. And this is exactly the meaning of the architectura. The architectura has to do with this attempt to use reasoning, to use knowledge, not just force and war, as a way to organize power, which of course is embodied in the very body, in the very corpus of the emperor. Another very important aspect of Augustus is exactly because he ends the civil wars and therefore impose what would be called the Pax Romana. He is a fundamental promoter of the reconstruction of Rome. And in fact, this is an image of Rome at the time of Augustus. Before Augustus, Rome was concentrated mostly to the what actually now is the east part of the city. And of course, a very important spot is the Roman Forum, which is the very center of Rome. And Augustus would be responsible to extend Rome towards the Campo Marzio, this part of the city, which will become the very monumental center of Rome, the one that will host all the main monuments, especially those built in stone. And in fact, is known how Augustus, towards the end of his life, said, I received a city made of bricks, and I actually give it back as a made of stone, which in fact symbolized the specific role of building, of edificatio, as one of the projects through which Augustus reconstructed its power. Here you see actually a very important monument built during the time of Augustus, the Octavie Portico, which in fact represents the building renaissance that in fact Vitruvius addressed in his book. I mean, he's writing the Architettura because he sees after this 100 years of civil war, the possibility for architecture to re-civilize almost the city, starting from its spatial, let's say, an architectural organization. But again, as in a way I've said before, one of the obsessions of Vitruvius' theory is the concept of the body. The body actually, if you take other civilizations' architecture, there is not this kind of rather bizarre analogy between body and architecture that has been so important in the development of Western architecture. And again, as I said before, Vitruvius actually used this analogy of the body to really emphasize the goal, the aspiration to unity that is so important in the architectural project, which, as you have seen, resonates with Augustus' imperium, with the attempt to really pacify and construct the empire, not on the basis of just conflict, but also on the basis of the political reorganization of the entire, let's say, civilization. And of course, the concept of body, the corpus, is a word that, as I said before, Vitruvius repeats many times. At the beginning of the third book, when Vitruvius actually explained the fundamental characteristics of the orders within actually his description of temples, he makes this famous description of the human body as a sort of measure, as a reference for the understanding of the integrity of architecture. This is a famous illustration by Cesare Cesariano, who actually will translate, let's say, Vitruvius' man, as it's known today, in this very famous representation. But again, I really want to stress this aspect of Vitruvius' theory. His reference to the body has nothing of the humanistic overtones that we often read in descriptions of the human scale in relationship to architecture. Vitruvius' understanding of the human body as the very basis of architecture is both much more transcendental. It has to do with this idea of symmetry and unity, of which the human body is the full representation, but also very practical. In the construction of the new empire, it's very important to stress the idea of a common measure, because it's only through the idea of a common measure that this sort of rather complex entity can be established. And of course, this is why proportions plays a fundamental role in Vitruvius' theory. It's just because they are the guarantees, the visual guarantees that construction is not just an immanent process, but has its own transcendental value through measures, of which the orders, which Vitruvius called types, are the most fundamental representation. And this actually will be one of the legacies that will have a terrific influence on the development of modern architecture, starting from the 15th century, in which actually the rediscovery of Vitruvius' theories will play a fundamental role. But as I said before, a fundamental topic of Vitruvius' theory are, on one hand, temples and machines. So two, in a way, antithetical representations of architecture. Again, the temple, as I said before, plays a very important role in the birth of the new empire, because it was through the construction of a new religious ethos that the Roman emperor and the empire could reestablish a social and political consensus that was all the time threatened by the, let's say, rather eclectic form of ancient Roman religion. And in fact, as you know, one of the reasons of the decline of the Roman Empire will be precisely the rise of new religions, such as Christianity, which will, from within, from the very convictions and habits and customs of the people, from the very roots of the ethos, will in fact fragment and destroy the strength of this political, let's say, organization. The other, and of course, the Temple of Jupiter, which Augustus reconstructed on the Capitol, really embodies the idea of temple that Vitruvius described in the Architettura, which is still the temple which has nothing to do with the inventiveness and creativity of many other examples of Roman architecture, which Vitruvius does not mention. He mentioned the temple because it's only the temples that embody this analogical, let's say, representation of power through basically its contents, but also through its form, through its perfect symmetry. But of course, the other, let's say, outcome of Vitruvius' expertise is his incredible familiarity with machines, and especially with war machines. Vitruvius has a great knowledge. He has both design, perhaps, and use ballistas and catapults, machines that were the artillery of ancient Greek and Roman warfare. Very important, let's say, and very difficult to construct, especially because the strength of this machine was not so much in their heaviness of what they were supposed to throw, but on the, let's say, reliable direction of the, let's say, bullets that were supposed to basically thrown against the enemy. Therefore, a machine was a great source of engineering inventiveness. And in fact, there is a very interesting article by Bernard Cash, one of the founding fathers of parametric design. I'm sure Bernard will be horrified by this definition of his work, but one of the first to have dealt with digital architecture in a very, let's say, thorough and scholar way, which sees, in fact, Vitruvius' Fen book, the last book, as one of the most radical projects in which parametric design is introduced in order to control an entity that is no longer actually based simply on symmetry and the stability of architecture, but has to do with movement and elasticity, which is a fundamental characteristics of these particular machines. What is interesting is that this, in a way, is the conclusion of the Architettura. So the Architettura really terminates with the design of these machines. And actually, the most strange aspect of the book is precisely the conclusion. If you read the last remarks of the Architettura, Vitruvius actually does not end with the perfection of buildings or machines, but ends with stratagems that have been used by besieged populations, like, for example, Rhodinians or the city of Marseille, Massilla, who actually were among the last, especially Marseille, one of the last city to resist to the, let's say, conquer by the Romans, a free city, which was put under siege by the Romans. Of course, the machines were at the service of those who were moving siege against a particular city. But the last part of the book is really on those who are defending their own city. And Vitruvius actually tells very, well, not funny, but rather interesting stories about how these besieged people were defending their, let's say, their city. This is actually an illustration of the siege of Marseille, where in fact, one of the way the Romans would put a city under siege was to dig long tunnels underground in order to surface in the city in the most unexpected way, because of course, those who were besieged were locked inside the city and have very limited view of what's happening around their territory. This technique that Vitruvius described both in Rodi, in the siege of Rodi, and the siege of Marseille. So what the besieged, so those who are fighting in the opposing camp of Vitruvius have make different stratagems in order to basically fight back this siege. In the first, they deepen a moat in order to basically stop the tunnel that is under construction, or they build a sort of beds made of woods, and when the machine is carried on towards actually the city walls, with darts, the besieged actually fire this ramp and therefore destroy those machines. Or the most interesting story, which is not shown in these illustrations, is during the siege of Rodi, when basically, of course, the Romans are still using this technique of digging underground. And it's very interesting that at the end of the 10 books, Vitruvius comes back to the ground, you know? He goes back to underground, so something that has nothing to do with the main, let's say, representation of architecture. So these Roman soldiers are digging this tunnel. The people within the Rodi are panicking because they don't know where these people will surface. And so they have this idea of placing, let's say, to make also tunnels inside actually the city, place vessels, which, of course, when the Romans would approach these tunnels built by the besieged, would start to clang. And therefore, the people from Rodi would know from where the Romans are coming, and they would actually thrown inside these tunnels, which of course will connect with the tunnels built by the besieged, either hot water, and in another occasion, and this is a really funny, Vitruvius mentioned that they throw also human excrement. So they basically overflows the Romans coming from this tunnel with shit. So shit is the very final scenario of the Architettura, which in fact starts with mud, with the very beginning of cities. But actually it's a very interesting remark, very strange, because in a way Vitruvius ends the Architettura, which addressed the emperor with a scene that sees the Romans defeated by free people. I mean, Marseille was one of the last free city-states fighting against the Romans in the Mediterranean. But what is even more interesting is that this is an opportunity for Vitruvius to finally stress the fundamental core of architecture, which of course is reasoning, as we have seen before, the art of thinking, of organizing, which is necessary, for example, for the building of temples, but also of machines. But is also, the other aspect is solertia, readiness. Solertia can be translated as deviation from the norm, no? Which allows this besiege in this totally chaotic and panic situation to respond and defeats the incredible rationality of the machines that Vitruvius described in the last 10 book. And it's precisely the sort of relationship between ratio and solertia that from Vitruvian on will be the very, let's say, core of any architectural theory, and that Vitruvius identified not only as the fundamental core of architectural knowledge, but as the very idea of, let's say, of a political power in which not only the imposition of an order, but also the readiness to constantly understand how whoever is opposing that order would, in a way, resist or fight back is important in the, let's say, understanding of the way civilization and the ethos of a civilization is constructed. Thank you very much. I don't know actually if I'm supposed to take questions or I don't know, Brett, how that works. 2 questions or 1? Well, if not, you can prepare the question next time, and we can begin with your questions for today. Thank you.